Let's open with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we come to your feet asking for your blessing as we open your word. Please guide us as we recap things that have been shared with us over the course of the Midnight Cry. We come praying all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so good afternoon or good evening or good day, depending on where you are. I guess what I've been looking at is I've been reviewing some of the material that's been shared over the course of the Midnight Cry. And in a recent presentation, Elder Tess mentioned that the Midnight Cry has opened up essentially 3 histories to us, right? It's opened up light on 3 lines. Of course, it's done more than that, but for the purposes of the presentation that she was giving, she highlighted 3 lines that have been opened up, with greater light by the Midnight Cry. Does anyone want to venture to state what those 3 lines are? You may recall. Does anyone want to venture to state what were the 3 lines that she mentioned?
The counterfeit, is that one of them?
Yes, the counterfeit.
Protestantism.
Protestantism.
Modern Israel.
And modern Israel, essentially, right? So now this is the Zoom's in-house whiteboard. It's not great, but we will do what we can with it. So we identified modern Israel. Okay. Again, this whiteboard really isn't great. The counterfeit, yes. And Protestantism. Also, just put Protestant that way. So these were the 3 histories that have been opened up by the Midnight Cry. And she identified a pattern that you see in all 3 of these histories. And what was that? For those of you who recall what she had to say, she identified that all these histories, modern Israel, the counterfeit, and Protestantism, they essentially follow the same pattern.
Failure,
What was
failure,
that pattern?
success.
Exactly, right? You have a pattern of failure, I'll just put F, failure, and success. I was recently going over some of the studies from the camp meeting in Guadeloupe that happened in 2019. Well, I remember I was there personally for that, and that was the first time I heard this concept of when you look at modern Israel, that it's really not just 2 histories that we're looking at. Before, we principally viewed it through the lens of Alpha and Omega, right? The beginning and the end. But this way of viewing it, not just looking at the beginning and the end, but viewing the entirety of it as a unit and seeing within it a 3-part rather than 2-part pattern. I remember how, revolutionary or intriguing that thought was. And, in the moment, it opened up so much. but we have modern Israel, the counterfeit, and Protestantism. Yeah, I'll have to do that. All right, so of course we know the pattern is failure, failure, and success. I don't think I have space on my whiteboard to put that on top. Let's see, let's try failure, failure, success. Okay. And the first period of modern Israel, which ended in failure, was 1798, as we know, to 1863. Right. The second period, which also ended in failure for modern Israel, was 1888. And the third period, which ends in success, is our reform movement, which carries us from 1989 essentially through to the second coming, through to the end. When we look at Protestantism, the first history of failure for Protestantism is that 1888 history, right? The second in this pattern that you can see is 1950 to the 1950s, essentially. I'll put 1950 to 1960. And the third is 1979 to the end, right? We'll put second coming, although in my notes I have Sunday law. Right, and with the counterfeit of the papacy, we see essentially the same pattern of failure, failure, and success, which parallels that or mirrors that of modern Israel. And with the counterfeit, the first period of failure was 1899 to 1945. This was the essentially the time period encompassing the First and Second World War. Then we come to 1989. The history in connection with the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. And then its third period of success is 2001 up to the present. I'll just put second coming, although it's blank in my notes there. Okay, so all these histories follow the same pattern. And I've just been making a point in my mind to say, I want to recap, I want to review these three lines that have been opened up by the Midnight Cry. And I began with the counterfeit. So that's essentially what I'll be reviewing with us here. And I'll ask us, remember, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And, so that the exercise is as beneficial as it can be for everyone. So I was looking at the counterfeit and Protestantism and of course, modern Israel. But for our purposes today, we're going to look at the counterfeit and see how far we can get with it. When we consider the counterfeit, and I remember this was also a revolutionary thought at the time, because in the movement up until that time, and I remember specific instances, I remember, if I may state it, I remember times at FFA, when certain issues would come up. I think the context of the conversation doesn't matter, but I remember the idea being communicated that this person has spent so much time studying the beast. They are now demonstrating the characteristics of the beast in their behavior. By the beast, the papacy, right? This person spends so much time studying the beast, so much time studying the counterfeit, that they are, now starting to reflect the beast in what was going on at that time. And but now under the midnight cry, this emphasis was being brought out that we do need to study the beast. We do need to understand the beast. We do need to study it. Well, I think for obvious reasons. It is one of the key players in the closing scenes as we understand them, right? Of course, there's the king of the south. The beast is the papacy, the counterfeit, Protestantism, and modern Israel. Those are the key players that you have on the stage of action, right? But it was brought out that we do need to understand the papacy and its role in the closing scenes. But the means by which we go about that, a concept was shared, a parable, the parable of the banknote. What is the parable of the banknote? Does anyone remember from back then? The parable of the banknote, if any. Do we recall what that was?
Sorry, I'm not catching what you're saying. The parable of what?
The banknote. You got a banknote?
Banknote.
$10.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What is the parable of that?
You only have to study the good one, and then you'll know all the counterfeit ones. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. You do need to be able to identify the counterfeit, right? But how do you go about that? And how they go about it is that they study the true, and they understand the true so well that when they're presented with the counterfeit, they're able to detect it on sight, right? So the counsel was given that if ever you get confused in your study of the counterfeit, go back and look at the true. The pattern or models that you see in the true are what are, duplicated or mimicked by the counterfeit, right? So I will attempt to open a new page on this whiteboard. And we want to lay out the history of the counterfeit over this, big picture representation of it, where we see the histories of failure, and success. But in order to do that, our starting point must of necessity be the true. So we will lay out the history of the true, and I'll try to do so as best as I can with this imperfect tool that I have. My lines won't be straight, unfortunately, but I'll do the best I can. It's not too bad. So we begin our consideration of the counterfeit by beginning with the true, and the true is modern Israel. The papacy is a counterfeit of God's church. And when we look at the history of modern Israel in this sort of large scale, right, this particular parable or model, which takes in its entire history and identifies this pattern of failure, and success, it begins in 538. And what do you have in 538? You have a scattering. That's what S represents. And in this period of scattering, it begins in 538 for 1260 years, and it continues on until 1798. So you have a period of scattering, and then the 1798 marks the end of that period of scattering. And what do you have taking place to mark the end of that period of scattering? I'll ask us. What takes place to mark the end of that period of scattering? You can mark a number of things, but for our purposes, I'm looking for something in particular.
Deadly wound?
Deadly wound, of course, yes. What else happened in 1798?
The
No?
arrival of the first angel?
Yes, the arrival of the first angel, but when a message arrives, what must it have to convey it?
The opening of the book? I'm not sure. Like, what do you
Well,
mean? Like messengers?
We
Like
have the message. You must have,
people?
exactly. Victoria says a messenger, right? Where you have the message that needs to go out, you must of necessity have a messenger to carry it. So 1798, that's where we mark the beginning of the rise of William Miller, right? So we go from 1798, and this marks the beginning of a period of gathering. We'll put a G over here, okay? When does this gathering end?
Elder Tabo, can I ask a question real quick? Is this are we looking at the counterfeit line, or are we what line are we looking at in
Okay, I'll reiterate that. We're going to look at the counterfeit line, but the counterfeit is that it's a counterfeit of something else. So if you want to understand the counterfeit, you must look at the original.
Oh, okay, so we're
And
looking at the original first,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah, we're looking at modern Israel, right? So we're going to lay out this line for modern Israel. Then we're going to go to the counterfeit and see how it perfectly mimics it at each step of the way. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Victoria? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so and Tiffany put 1844. So there's a gathering from 1798 to 1844. And in that time period, we can mark two-way marks essentially. There's 1888, which is the increase of knowledge. Then there's 1833.
Not 1888.
Oh, my bad. Thank you. Thank you. Someone's awake. 1818. Remember, it was 1816 to 1818. Sorry, this isn't great. I'll try it again. Thanks for that, Ms. Tiffany. 1818 to, and then the formalization is 1833. Okay. Then you have a disappointment in 1844. So from October 22nd, 1844, you have the Great Disappointment. And of course, as we read the history, what happened to them? They were scattered. So another period of scattering follows. And when does this period of scattering end? When does this period of scattering end?
Is it 1850?
1850. What happened in 1850?
They produced the second chart.
Yes, you have the 1850 chart inaugurating a new period of evangelism, right? As the message goes to the world.
Hey, Tabo,
So yes,
I have a question.
go ahead, my brother.
So, you know the quotes that talk about them going into Laodicea around 1849, 1850 time period? You're familiar with those?
Yes.
So how do you put together those two ideas? Just the fact that they're getting gathered, you know, I get it. Like they made a chart and they're going to win the world, and that makes sense. But then you have those quotes about them going into Laodicea. Have you ever kind of thought about those two things kind of happening simultaneously, almost like? Does that?
Yeah, it presents a conundrum that you know, we naturally struggle with, you know, which is, how can two seemingly contradictory concepts be true at the same time? But let's put it out there. How do you reconcile that? If we reason it through, if anyone wants to speak to that, how would you reconcile that?
Can you repeat the question?
He's pointing he's identifying that it was prior to 1863. It was, if my memory serves me correctly, you may know the exact dates, Trevor, but it was in the 1950s that, you know, the identification that the church is Laodicea begins to be made, right? So it's before 1863 that the identification of Laodicea begins to be made. But what we are saying here is, you know, there's a chart produced and there is a new evangelization of the world taking place. And that this time period from 1850, it probably goes without saying that the next period here is 1863, okay? And we are saying that from 1850 to 1863, that this is a gathering. So what he's asking is, how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile that from 1850 to 1863, we're calling it a gathering here, but if you read her, this was the time of Laodicea, that the identification of Laodicea starts to be made. How do you reconcile that?
Can't God still try to do a work even though the people are failing? So I don't know, but for me, it's a line of failure, but the pattern still remains. And so he's still trying to gather. Like, I'm not sure, but that's how I see it.
Okay.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Was that Jonathan?
Yeah,
go
ahead.
Okay, but Sister White, she says in 1850 that God is trying a second attempt to gather his people before the second coming. So even though they fall into a Laodicean condition, is still trying to have a people complete by 1863. And so that's why we see this discrepancy.
And also people still have to be tested, right? So in that time, there are people who are faithful during that time that aren't in Laodicea, right? But I'm not sure how that works exactly, but I would assume that the pattern has to remain the same. It's the same testing needs to take place.
In that time, higher medicine was to write these letters. So God was working through a new messenger, which would be a gathering, just like 1798 was a gathering with William Miller. And so the group itself they had rejected, I don't remember exactly what happened, but I thought that they had rejected some of the light that God was giving leading up to 1850. And higher medicine was given a role as a new messenger, and he didn't complete those letters, as far as I understand, in that time. But God was working in that time to do a gathering through him, I thought.
Are you referring to?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Edwin, or are you referring to Lich. Wasn't it Lich?
No, higher medicine was, there were 7, he had his unfinished letters or something. I can't remember exactly what they were, but they had to do, I'd have to go back and look. There's a document that is around that was, it actually says at the end, it was incomplete or unfinished. And it was from higher medicine.
Of the Gentiles.
That's the one.
Yeah. It was a series of articles he did called The Times of the Gentiles. And what it was doing is it was opening up that it was opening up the first line of the 2520. They saw the line of the 2520, which ended in 1844. He was arguing, that, the line which ended in 1798, was the correct one. That's what he was arguing. But what that would have done, had they seen that, no, actually both of them are correct, which they didn't see at the time, had they followed through to develop that study further, what bringing those two studies together would have done is that it would have set them up to see, exactly as Jonathan said, it would have set them up to see the chiasm from 723 to 677 and 1798 and 1844, but also that parallel from 742 at the beginning to 1863 at the end. It would have enabled them to see that chiasm, and I guess to identify the fact that, they were in a time period when God was trying to gather them, right? And they needed to act in accordance with that understanding. But of course, he never finished those articles. That concept was not fully developed, in that dispensation. That identification was made in our dispensation. But I guess the answer to Trevor's question, which makes sense to me, I think, which is, I guess the rationale that I have is, both things are true. You have God initiating a period of gathering, right? He has ordained this time period for a specific purpose, but then you also have his people entering into a Laodicean condition, right? And really ultimately failing to accomplish the purpose he had ordained for them in that period of time, as a result of the fact that they'd entered into a Laodicean condition. So while both concepts appear contradictory, they are, both things can be true at the same time. And I think Elder Tess has said this, that this is a natural human struggle, that, we struggle to hold more than one concept in our minds at any given period of time. It's something that, it's like a muscle that you must develop, right? Being able to conceptualize a single subject from multiple perspectives, right? But there are a bunch of comments that have come in. Edson eventually rejected the 2520. That's why he didn't finish the articles. I don't remember that history. I don't remember where he eventually went with the 2520. Personally, all I remember was, again, as you said, that he writes at the end of the articles that I've been busy about my secular work and I haven't had time to develop these thoughts further. But what I have, I'm setting before you for your consideration. But it didn't go beyond that. But I mean, if folks want to look at that further, I guess Jonathan says, well, he obviously rejected it. Well, I mean, they come to 1863 and they officially reject it as a movement. So yeah. So we have 1850. So Trevor, I hope that helps in terms of answering your question.
Yeah, no, I guess it does. Yeah, just the state of God's people versus what God is trying to do. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the people are cooperating or ready, but there's a difference there, and that's fine. God can be trying to
Yeah.
work with all of us in another way when we fight it, right? So makes sense.
Sure. All right. So you have this period from 1850 to 1863, which is a gathering. And in 1863, you have two developments. You have two developments. One is organization, right? Organization, which is fundamentally, was organization a good or a bad thing?
A good thing.
You have organization as a good thing, right? And you also have the rejection of the message. You have the message rejected, and of course that's a bad thing. Okay. So those are the two developments that you have in 1863. And then you have this time period, this 1888 time period, where of course you have a conflict taking place over this message that was carried by Jones and Waggoner. Jones and Waggoner, okay? And they were in conflict with Butler and Smith, the conference president Butler and Uriah Smith. So this 1888 time period, if you're familiar with the history, was a history of failure. God tried to pour out his spirit, but his people rejected it. And as a result of that rejection, they failed to receive the power of the spirit that would have empowered them to give the loud cry in that time period when the Sunday law was moving through Congress, right? And it's around that time period, if not shortly after, that Ellen White begins to say things like, we may have to stay much longer in this world than we needed to because of insubordination, and similar statements like that. But in this 1888, let's see, I see your comment there, Jonathan. You're saying what Jones and Waggoner considered the second and third angel. That was not a logic that was articulated at that time. There was no such logic in that time period. I don't think it's something that we say, but in that time period, that's no identification that you can see either in their writings or in anything Ellen White had to say about what was going on at that time. She just identifies them as God's chosen vessels for the communication of this message, which she was saying was God's attempt to pour out the latter rain. If anyone else has anything. Yep.
Isn't there a quote, Tabo, where she says by rejecting their messages, they essentially stopped the glory that the angel that was to come and fill the earth with its glory, they shut the glory off to the world?
Yes, there is a quote to that effect. Maybe I can fish it out quickly.
I don't know if that would help with that question or not, but
I think I can fish it out quickly. Just opening my documents here. Okay, it is. Sorry, almost there. It is 1888 materials, page 1575. Right, so that's 1888, 1575. It says, an unwillingness to yield up preconceived opinions and to accept this truth lay at the foundation of a large share of the opposition manifested at Minneapolis against the Lord's message through Brethren Waggoner and Jones. By exciting that opposition, Satan succeeded in shutting away from our people in a great measure the special power of the Holy Spirit that God longed to impart to them. The enemy prevented them from obtaining that efficiency which might have been theirs in carrying the truth to the world, as the apostles proclaimed it after the day of Pentecost. The light that is to lighten the whole earth with its glory was resisted, and by the action of our own brethren has been a great degree kept from the world, has been in a great degree kept from the world. Right. So, I guess moving on. So you have 1888, this failure taking place as the latter-rain message is rejected. But you can't separate 1888 from the history leading up to it. 1886, there's an important development where you have Butler. The 1888, the rejection of the latter-rain message in 1888 happened within the context of a controversy over the law in the book of Galatians, right? It was this debate over the law in the book of Galatians which soured the atmosphere, so that when the 1888 message came, because of the vessels that were bringing it, right? The old guard, the president and the old teachers and the old leaders braced themselves to resist it, right? So in 1886, G.I. Butler, he published a document on the law in Galatians opposing the view that was being taught by Waggoner, and of which Ellen White had communicated that neither of them had all the light on that particular issue. But the debate became, maybe toxic is the term. It became toxic, so toxic that it drew clear divisions and divided people in two camps. The old guard and the young Turks, shall we say? The young Turks being Jones and Waggoner, and Ellen White siding with Jones and Waggoner in 1888. But you have that context, 1886 leading to 1888, and then you come to 1989. And 1989 inaugurates the final period of gathering. But you have this entire period from 1863 to 1989. This is one long period of scattering, right? So you have this pattern of scattering, gathering, scattering, gathering, scattering, and then a final gathering. 1989, what do you have? You have Elder Jeff being raised up, just as Miller was raised up in the beginning. And this, of course, is the final movement. So you have this model for conceptualizing the history of modern Israel, which takes you all the way from the first gathering and the scattering that preceded it, right through in a line to us, the final reformatory movement. And when we speak of the counterfeit, understanding the papacy, it is the counterfeit. It is Satan's masterpiece in counterfeiting God's work. So we take that principle to form the basis of our modeling of the line of the counterfeit.
I think Effie had a question.
Oh, so, and feel free to stop me because the way things are in front of my screen, I don't always see the chat.
I was
Who had a
just wondering
question?
if there was a gathering in 1888 followed by a scattering?
Well, there was no gathering in 1888 because from the general, well, firstly, the leadership of the church rejected the latter rain message at the general conference, right, in Minneapolis in 1888. And they rejected it there, and they would not support those who were sharing it. So Ellen White and Jones and Wagner began to, go on a circuit of traveling and taking this message directly to the congregations. And the leaders who had rejected it, in order to put a stop to what they were doing, they split them up. I think at that point, one of them, either Jones or Wagner, I think maybe it was Wagner, one of them was sent to Europe. And it was not long after that Ellen White was sent to Australia, right? Split them up to put an end to what they were doing. So by her own testimony, the message was withheld from the people. So there's no gathering that took place in that time. Not that there wasn't, it's not simply that there wasn't a gathering of people, but the very message which was meant to produce that gathering was withheld from the people. So there was no gathering then. It was just a failure, and failed because of the leaders of the church at the time.
Okay.
David, yes? David, your mic is open. Oh, that's not David. Oh, Annabelle. Sorry, yes. Does that help, Annabelle?
Yes. So it's just a scattering all the way from 63 on to 89.
Yeah, it's just scattering all the way. So what we've laid out here, it forms the basis for a consideration of the history of the counterfeit, which we will enter into now. And I will ask for your forgiveness again with the line that I'm about to draw. So the time period of 1798, there's a parallel here. Oh, I don't have space for it, but that's okay. Let's just do this. The history of modern Israel begins with a gathering which began in 1798. But that very same time period in 1798 was what for the papacy? It was a scattering, right? The deadly wound. But what led up to the scattering in 1798? We can conceptualize scattering differently. We could call it a scattering. That's one way of conceptualizing it. Another way of conceptualizing it would be, them going into captivity, right? And if you view what happened to the papacy in 1798 as they're going into captivity, yes, Katia said it, God suffers his people to go into captivity for a purpose. It's like cause and effect that you see throughout his word. They go into captivity because of apostasy. when they apostatize and don't do the work that he has appointed for them to do, he suffers them to go into captivity and learn through affliction what they refuse to learn in a time of peace. So 1798, the papacy goes into captivity. But leading up to that, very shortly before that, you have 1773. And what happened in 1773, as Katya said in the chat, you have the abolition of the Jesuits, of the Jesuit order. So the Jesuits were at the forefront of persecuting God's people in those dark ages. And what was the papacy's mission? That its God has given it, its God being Satan. It was to persecute and to destroy the church. But the Pope abolished the Jesuits in 1773. And why did he do that? Because he came under pressure from the kings of Europe, who essentially gave him an ultimatum that all your lands that you have in holding in our territories and so on, we want you to abolish the Jesuits and we'll let you keep your land. But if you won't abolish the Jesuits, then it's essentially they were threatening them, it's going to be a fight, right? They were threatening their property. And what did the papacy choose? Some comments there. What did the papacy choose? They chose worldly prosperity. They said, you know what, this hard work of persecuting the church, our mission, is to, we're going to let go of that and we're going to focus on our worldly prosperity. We're going to keep our lands, right? So they apostatized from their master, who was Satan, in 1773, and the result was the scattering that they suffered in 1798. You see things beginning to turn around. A period of gathering is inaugurated in 1899. You have a period of gathering being inaugurated, just like the pattern that we see for modern Israel. And we mark the gathering in 1798. We see a messenger beginning to be raised up. And with the papacy in 1899, this is when you see the raising up of a messenger. And who was this messenger? This was a man who would eventually become Pope. Pope Pius the 6th? Is it the 6th?
12th.
The 12th, isn't it? Right?
12.
This was Eugenio
I think
Pacelli.
it's 12.
I don't think it's 12. I have them listed somewhere here. Hang on.
Google it, you'll see.
I'm sure it's Pius the 6th. Oh, yeah. Oh, you're right. It's Pius the 12th. There was a Paul the 6th, Pius the 12th. Sorry about that. You're correct. So a man begins to be raised up, Eugenio Pacelli, who would eventually become Pope Pius the 12th. And what happens in 1899? 1899, he is ordained as a Catholic priest. He's ordained on the 2nd of April, 1899. And a bit of background on Pacelli: he came from a family of Vatican lawyers that were extremely dedicated to the papacy. His father was Mark Antonio Pacelli. Oh yes, Jonathan. Yeah. Pius VI was the one who was the Pope, was captured by Napoleon. He was Pius VI. This is Pius the 12th. Interesting. A Pius was scattered, and a Pius is marking the beginning of the gathering. Right. Interesting pattern there. But his grandfather, Eugenio Pacelli, his grandfather was Mark Antonio Pacelli, who was the primary lawyer for the Pope about 60 years before Eugenio came on the scene as a priest. He had a brother, Francesco, who was also trained, who was trained under the same cardinal who would later apprentice Eugenio Pacelli in his studies, as in his preparation to be a diplomat, and in his studies as a Vatican lawyer. This is Cardinal Gaspari, who was one of the Pope's trusted lawyers as well. I'm just going to make a quick observation about these two brothers, Francesco and Eugenio Pacelli. Okay, so they both apprenticed under Cardinal Gaspari, one of the Pope's most trusted Vatican lawyers. Okay. Then you have the one brother, Francesco. Then you have the other brother, Eugenio. So of course, Eugenio would go on to become Pope. Pope Pius XII. And to develop a key development that you see Eugenio undertaking, a key development that he was responsible for, is entering into the Reichskonkordat. Sorry, make more space. The Reichskonkordat. And this was a treaty entered into with Hitler, that the papacy entered into with Hitler for strategic purposes. We're going to speak on that some more, but this was a key treaty in that time period. And this treaty was one of the key steps in securing Hitler's rise. Because within Germany, one of the major sources of opposition to Hitler in the early days was the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church was a force in Germany. And what this Reichskonkordat did was that it was an agreement by the Vatican that the Catholic Church in Germany would keep itself, would be apolitical. It would not involve itself in the politics, essentially leaving the way open for Hitler to do what he wanted, right? So this treaty, the Reichskonkordat, it paved the way for the rise of Hitler. And why did they do that? Because they were hoping that Nazi Germany would be the vehicle, it would be the beast that they would ride, that would put them back on a position of power and dominance on the world political stage at that time, right? The papacy is always looking for, right? And Germany was the beast that they were trying to saddle up at that time, if I may frame it that way. Was someone about to say something? Yes, Jonathan?
I just had a question about 1899. We marked Pacelli there, but he wasn't Pope yet. So was there a specific thing that we marked in that time in 1899 to
Yes,
mark?
and I was going to come back to that. 1899, he was ordained as a priest.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
He was ordained as a priest, but it's also when he began his studies of Vatican law. Is that what it's called? Is it? Hang on. He began his studies of
Canon law.
canon law, right? That's when he began his studies of canon law in 1899 as well. And, you know, his preeminence as an expert of canon law, you know, is what positioned him to do the work that he later did with these treaties and so on and so forth, among other things. So 1899, he's ordained as a priest and he begins his studies of canon law. Okay. So Eugenio was responsible for the Reichskonkordat, but Francesco, like his brother, he was also a Vatican diplomat, and he was responsible for the entering into the Lateran Treaty with another dictator. The Lateran Treaty entered into with Italy. That was governed by Mussolini at the time. What was the Lateran Treaty about? What did it do for the papacy? Do you recall that? What did the Lateran Treaty do to the papacy? Do for the papacy? When was the Lateran Treaty passed? It's not in my notes, but I seem to recall 1917.
Did it reestablish, I guess, physical land for them, like the Vatican? They became their own nation.
Exactly, right? Because the papacy
Political.
in 17. Hello?
No, I'm just
Yes,
saying
sorry?
political power. I'm just saying
Yes.
political power.
1929, thank you. Not 1917, 1929. Thank you for that. It was the treaty that gave the Vatican to the papacy and identified the Vatican as a sovereign state within Italy, within the city of Rome, right? Because the papacy had lost all its lands. And, you know, so the Lateran Treaty, Mussolini recognized that, you know, the Vatican in Rome is, you know, will be recognized, will have the status of a sovereign nation. So that's what the Lateran Treaty did for the papacy. And of course, Francesco Pacelli was the one, the brother of Eugenio, who accomplished that. So we'll continue on. So 1899, Pacelli begins his rise. He's ordained as a priest at the age of 23. And he's ordained on April 2nd, 1899. Right, and he would be sent in 1917 to Germany to negotiate this treaty, the treaty that would become known as the Reichskonkordat. But in order to prepare for that role, he entered into his studies for a doctorate of canon law, right? In the fall of 1899. So, okay. So going on, we have an increase of knowledge. and a formalization. What is the increase of knowledge? The increase of knowledge in 1917. These are the visions of Fatima. May 1917 are the visions of Fatima. So in 1916, an angel came down 3 times, counterfeiting the 3 angels' messages. And this prepared them for the 13th of May, 1917, when Mary, quote unquote, came down. And this is their increase of knowledge as a waymark in 1917, right? And as always, with this increase of knowledge, the essential elements of the message that they need to bear it's all contained in that increase of knowledge. So they were told there would be 6 visits, and they were promised a 7th. And on the 13th of June, which was the feast of Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony was the patron saint of speaking and teaching. The 13th of June was the feast of Saint Anthony. And this led to the 13th of July, when the children received the 3 secrets. And of these, sorry, my notes are, again, sorry, I'm cleaning up these notes, and I'm seeing some mistakes I made that I do need to sort out. So forgive me if I'm sounding a little confused. I've just been putting these together. So the first vision, on the 13th of July, the children received the 3 secrets. The first was a vision of hell, fear, right? The second was a call to dedicate Russia, with the threat of World War III. And the third was a message of judgment, which warned that the Pope and the entire church would be killed if they did not do that work that Satan was calling them to do. So you have 1917 as the increase of knowledge. It's interesting that on the 13th of May, 1917, while Mary was appearing in Fatima, in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, Pacelli was being consecrated as an archbishop. He was made archbishop on the very day that the visions of Fatima occurred, on the 13th of May, 1917. And he was made an archbishop for the purpose of representing the Vatican in Germany, where he was subsequently sent. A book is, to digress a little bit, a book is highlighted, 2 books actually, are highlighted as useful to read when seeking to understand this history. Right, and Aldertess references these 2 books. When she goes to the studies, she quotes from these 2 books. They're good to have. One is Hitler's Pope. Two books, Hitler's Pope and His Holiness. Hitler's Pope and His Holiness. I have Hitler's Pope, and I went through a couple of the chapters which detailed some of this history, particularly the history around Fatima and what was going on with Pacelli at the time. Then there's His Holiness, which are good books to have to do an in-depth study of this history. Okay, so we're running out of time. So I will move on. When I do get to share again, I'll probably recap some of this history and go through it in greater detail, because I actually hadn't intended on spending as much time as we did on the line of modern Israel, right? So, but for time, I'll just go ahead to 1833, with 1933, which is their formalization, the formalization of the counterfeit. And what happens in 1933? This was when the Concordat, the Reichskonkordat, was signed into law on July 20th, 1933. Right? Why was this Concordat entered into? I spoke to it earlier, but I'll just add that the purpose of the yeah, I think I'll just leave it there. Right? The purpose of the Concordat was to rein in the church in Germany. Right, to pave the way, which paved the way essentially for Hitler to rise unobstructed by the church at any rate. So in 1933, that Concordat was signed. I have a Wikipedia note about that, but we've probably said enough. So 1933 is the Concordat. Then you come to 1945. Where you have a disappointment. In 1945 parallels 1844, and you have a disappointment. What was the disappointment for the papacy in 1945? This was the fact that Hitler was defeated in the Second World War. Pius Pacelli, by that time, had become Pope. I'll just get the years over which he was a Pope. He was Pope from 1939 to 1958. Right, Pope Pius, he was Pope from 1939 to 1958. So he is Pope during those during the years of the Second World War. And throughout the years of the Second World War, he was careful not to give Hitler his public endorsement. He knew Hitler would go to war with Russia. And as a student of Fatima, he knew that Hitler would be important in that role of bringing down Russia. But Hitler, of course, had his own atrocities that he was guilty of. So the Pope never endorsed him publicly, but he also failed to condemn him, right? And that is why that book is called Hitler's Pope. It shows how, it frames that history as, a stark moral failure by the papacy under Pius to condemn, what were the greatest, firstly the belligerence of Germany, and then the greatest atrocities, in recent history that were committed by the Nazi regime. And he was remarkably silent, right? And he was trying to play this middle of the road position. The Allied powers wanted him to speak out against the German atrocities, but he never did so over the course of the entire war. And his motive was because he wanted to secure a position as a mediator at the appropriate time, as a mediator between the two, between the opposing forces. So he was giving the appearance of neutrality, hoping that it would position him, to mediate and be the champion who brought everyone together. But his hopes were dashed in 1945 when Hitler lost and the Allies did not call upon him to mediate. So he begrudgingly endorses democracy thereafter. And so the papacy loses the beast that it was trying to saddle up to ride, right? as Germany lost the war. And so he begrudgingly endorses democracy after that. And this marks the beginning of another period of scattering for the papacy. Right, a period of scattering which ends in 1950. I don't want to pile on too much. I don't want to pile on more history. We have like 5 minutes left. In that 5 minutes, I won't finish the 1950 waymark. So we'd best leave it there. And when we come back again, I will just recap. Again, my notes will be more tidy then, so I'll do it more cogently. Just recap this history of the counterfeit that we've gone through, make some points that I've purposely left out, and then we will continue to lay out the complete, the rest of the line, and then try to identify, some implications and some lessons about the way forward in this final gathering, time. In the couple of minutes that we have, do I have any more points or questions? Any more questions or points that people would like to make?
I was wondering if, and you don't have to do it now, it'll possibly be a part of your next one, but whether we'll look at why the counterfeit will be a success from 1989 to the Second Advent. We kind of hung on that for a while, not really understanding how a success looks for them in the end.
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, actually, because their final gathering, which is their period of success. Okay, you're speaking of their final gathering begins after 1989. We'll go through that, but it's definitely a good question. Why would it be a period of success for them, and what does that look like? We can ponder that and discuss it at the time. And discuss it when we come to it. Yeah, that's a good question, a good discussion point. Why will they be successful this time around, and what will that look like? Let's think about that. Let's think about that. So again, we're just seeing that the counterfeit perfectly mirrors the original, which is modern Israel. And the more we understand the original, the clearer we're able to see, to understand the counterfeit, and to identify the parallels between the original and the counterfeit. And again, the broader picture of these studies is just, Elder Tess highlighted that the Midnight Cry has given us 3 lines, right? Protestantism, the counterfeit, and modern Israel. And just making it an exercise of review to go through these 3 lines and try to have them presented like a package, right, in our reviews together. So if we don't have any more points, we can close here. I pray the study has been a blessing. And yeah.
Elder Tabo, isn't
Yes?
the movement and the counterfeit going to go like heads to head, so to speak? Is that why? I mean, I don't know what it will look like as a success for the papacy, for the counterfeit, but I mean, as far as people having to choose, and the conflict, the great controversy, it I don't know, I was just trying to grapple with my my thoughts from back when we went through these studies. But
And yes, that's essentially what's happening. These are 3 key players. If I say that they're 3 key players in the closing scenes: apostate Protestantism, God's church, and the papacy. And what this study shows of looking at them as these 3 lines, is showing their process of marshalling towards the final conflict, right? We are being prepared in this final form to the exact same thing is happening with the papacy. The exact same thing is happening with apostate Protestantism. These are three separate lines, but they're leading to the same place, right? Which is that final conflict. The Sunday law, waymark. Right. Hope that helps. Hopefully we'll see that more clearly as we go as well. All right, everyone, thank you. Thank you for your time. It's been a blessing to recap this. Let's close the word of prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the ground we've been able to cover in our time together. We ask that you may lead the way, that we may be able to continue, Lord, this exercise and recap, solidifying that which has been put on the record before. Lord, there's been so much light with the midnight cry. Help us to review, to retain. May these things become more firm in our minds. Wherever we are, Lord, whether it's morning or evening, as there are many people here, we ask, Lord, that you may keep all of us, and Lord, that you may bless every household represented of all of us who've gathered for this study. We ask for your blessing, dear Father. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.